A British couple, Nick and Meg, decide to revisit Paris, the city where they once celebrated their honeymoon, hoping to breathe new life into their marriage. As they board the train, the atmosphere buzzes with the energy of other couples and fellow travelers, each immersed in their individual pursuits. Nick, appearing somewhat disinterested, casually scans the surroundings, while Meg finds solace in the pages of a captivating book. As the train journey progresses, Nick frantically searches for the euros, only to realize he has forgotten them. Meg, being aware of his forgetfulness, gently reminds him. With a sheepish smile, Nick retrieves the euros and goes to pay for their passenger tickets. Upon arriving in Paris, Nick complains of being hungry. As they navigate the streets, their decent fluency in French pays off as they search for their hotel in Montmartre. However, their optimism dwindles upon reaching their hotel. It's a disappointment from the outset. No elevators, only flights of stairs. Still pushing through, the senior couple manage to ascend to the top floor. Despite the initial setbacks, they press on, determined to make the most of their journey in the city of love. Meg expresses her disappointment with the room's beige color, finding it less appealing than expected. Frustrated, she descends to the lobby to voice her complaint. Nick, sensing Meg's dissatisfaction, promptly follows her to the reception desk. Growing tired of the ordeal, Meg, visibly upset, exits the hotel. Hastily, Nick pursues her, grabbing their bags on the way out. Eager to escape the hotel's disappointment, Nick instructs the taxi driver to accelerate, appreciating the faster pace as they leave their accommodation woes behind. Meg, always yearning for more, urges the taxi driver to navigate various arrondissements, providing them with diverse views. Nick, however, grows increasingly discontented, voicing his complaints about Meg's pursuit of an extended scenic route. Clearly, they harbor different notions of what constitutes fun. In the midst of their playful banter, Meg impulsively decides to explore a particularly cool-looking hotel. Ignoring Nick's protests, she gracefully descends from the cab and, with an air of curiosity, ventures into the intriguing establishment. A heated argument ensues between the driver and Nick, conducted entirely in French, as they debate the detour's necessity. Despite the disagreement, they decide to step into the hotel that had caught Meg's eye. However, upon entering, they encounter an unforeseen issue. The hotel is fully booked with reservations, leaving no room for new guests unless reserved. Left wondering about their next move, Nick considers whether they should take the train back home. Meg appears very morose about it. Nick remarks that the trip is turning into the disaster he predicted. Meg gets mad at him, but Nick simply wants to please her, even if she doesn't seem interested. They agree that the trip has had a bit of a rough start. The first hotel they visited held sentimental value from a previous visit, and they wanted to relish those past memories. The good news arrives when the receptionist informs them of the possibility of securing a room with a special promo. The receptionist proposes a prestigious suite available for 2 nights, highlighting its uniqueness, as Tony Blair once slept there. Meg expresses her eagerness, pleading with Nick, who agrees on the condition that the sheets are changed. Meg is visibly delighted, providing passports and a credit card. However, Nick, being retired and cautious about money lasting through unexpected longevity, feels a bit anxious. Meg mentions about her taking up Zumba to improve her body, and Nick appears worried about it, because he wonders why Meg is keen on toning her body, and for whom. They finally enter the very nice suite. The staff, persistent in showing them around, prompts Nick to pay him off with tips until he finally leaves. They step out onto the balcony and are greeted by the amazing view of the magnificent tower. However, Meg, despite the breathtaking scene, feels a different kind of thirst, a desire for a drink. Her eyes fixate on the fridge stocked with alcohol. Meanwhile, Nick, concerned about expenses, voices his worry, stating that Paris seems brilliantly designed to extract money. Throughout this, Nick clings to a plastic bag, its contents unknown. Meg and Nick discuss the importance of making decisions on how to spend their money in Paris. Nick emphasizes that now is the opportune time to tackle important matters. Meg selects a bottle of champagne, and they relish it outdoors, immersing themselves in the city's ambience. Later, in the bedroom together, they discuss elevating their intimate experiences. Nick proposes the idea of pretending to be other people to add excitement. He emphasizes that, even in such playfulness, a man desires to make love to his wife out of love, rather than mere perversion. Going out, they climb a set of staircases and realize how they have gotten old, as their physical bodies are weakening as they breathe heavily. They check out the top view of the city, and Meg, captivated by the idea, thinks it could be a good place to live. Nick suggests they could find an apartment, expressing the possibility of being artists in Paris. Despite his optimism, Meg worries about earning money, but Nick reassures her, stating that they've worked long enough. In a lighthearted moment, Meg laughs off the idea. Later, their son Jack calls Nick, inquiring about their well-being, revealing a good relationship. Nick shares with his son that they haven't argued yet, and that he's falling in love with Meg all over again. From a distance, Meg watches, then decides to enter a church. The son informs Nick about a problem with the property, revealing it's infested with rats. Meg, understanding the issue, disagrees with Nick's inclination to help their son. Their son has a 3-month-old baby, and an argument ensues as Nick asserts that their son's wife is intolerable. Meg refuses to assist, as she is happy getting rid of their son from their house. Attempting to comfort Meg, Nick tries to cuddle, but she rejects his physical attention. Curious, Nick asks why Meg never lets him touch her. In response, Meg articulates that it makes her feel confined and restricted. Meg, however, challenges Nick to kiss her in front of many people in the cathedral. One onlooker becomes angry, but the old couple just laughs it off. They spot an even older couple walking down the road, and Nick expresses a hope to be like them in 10 years. Playfully, Nick teases Meg for a kiss, and as the teasing continues, Meg pushes him, causing him to hit his knee on the pavement. Concerned, Meg rushes to help, but Nick resists her assistance. Meg scolds him and walks away, but then turns around, and they both laugh about the playful incident. They decide on where to eat, and Meg, visibly concerned about Nick's knee, sweetly kisses him. Jumping from one restaurant to another, they find none that suits their tastes, either too modern, too empty, or too touristy. Finally, they settle on a restaurant for lunch. As they sit down and peruse the menu, abundant with options, making a decision becomes more difficult. So Meg simplifies things by asking for the best on the menu, and requests the waiter to surprise them. They conclude their meal with wine, and Meg expresses her appreciation, deeming the lunch the nicest thing she's ever tasted. Later, she thanks Nick for bringing her to Paris, and they share a moment by feeding each other. Meg expresses her skepticism, because Nick has been attacking her lately. They delve into how they express love, with Meg revealing a lot about Nick, acknowledging his role in editing out arguments and maintaining a consistently positive demeanor. However, Meg notices a change in Nick's expression, and he slowly unveils a concerning revelation. Nick discloses that his colleagues advised him to take an early retirement due to an official complaint from a student. The complaint stemmed from Nick's comment on the student's hair, which he made under the impression that the student wasn't focusing on studies. Unbeknownst to Nick, this comment insulted the student's entire background, history, and identity, leading to a complaint to the dean. Meg laughs, but her greater concern is why Nick hasn't shared this information with her earlier. After lunch, they take a stroll to a famous cemetery where renowned philosophers and writers rest. They visit the graves of Beckett, Sartre, and others one by one. Nick reminisces about his youth, recalling how he was a star in school, brilliant, and always excelling with multiple skills. However, he doesn't realize that he has become mediocre. Meg points out his many talents, highlighting that he has discarded them, and suggests it's because he's a masochist. Meg suggests that it's not too late for Nick to find a new direction. However, Nick disagrees, asserting that people don't change, whether for the better or worse. Nick is at the ATM getting money, visibly shaking his hands, likely due to financial concerns. Later, he gazes at a French girl on a bike from a distance. His stare is not weird, just a blank, distant gaze. Back in the hotel, Meg and Nick discuss symptoms of skin cancer and Alzheimer's, both expressing concern about their health. Before going to sleep, Nick sneaks in a kiss on her. In the morning, Nick listens to his iPod while drinking and singing along with it. Against his own advice, he consumes the expensive drinks and the sweet. However, as he drinks, he looks away and appears distant. Meg awakens and observes silently. They head out for their second trip, but Nick forgets his keys, trying to jog his memory. Meg plays along, engaging Nick playfully even though many people are watching, as the panda statues seem to be looking at her. They venture out for the night and express a desire to eat oysters. While dining, they discuss their codependency, feeling inseparable. Nick wonders why Meg doesn't want to help young people, but Meg glares at him and berates him. Meg desires a new start. Despite being a biology teacher, she has no interest in running a department in her school. Instead, she craves new experiences, like studying Italian or learning tango. Meg questions if this is a terrible idea, contemplating what their relationship will look like once the kids are gone. Unbeknownst to Nick, Meg is unknowingly contemplating separation. Nick, however, is understandably upset that Meg is choosing their anniversary to discuss ending the relationship. Meg gently sways him away so they can have a peaceful dinner instead. However, Nick stands up and retreats to the bathroom to wallow. Meg volunteers to pay for their last supper. However, she checks the bill and doesn't seem to like it. So she asks the waiter to step outside, collect their coats, and wait. Nick is utterly confused at this point, of course, but he complies nonetheless. Meg sits there waiting for a moment. Then she comes down, opens other rooms, and tries to find a way out. Quietly walking, Meg discovers a tunnel under the restaurant in an attempt to make her escape, revealing that she is trying to avoid paying the bill. She reaches her hand out and asks Nick for help to get out of the locked gate. Together, they successfully escape and run away. They buy some cheap drinks and use the pull tabs, putting them on Meg's fingers. Meanwhile, they kiss as people cheer for them. Later, an old friend of Nick recognizes him. The man pulls him into a hug, and the two old men are in disbelief at seeing each other again. It appears they haven't seen each other in a long time, as it's the first time the man is seeing Nick's whiff. The man's name is Morgan, and he expresses appreciation for Meg's beauty. Morgan, who has lived in New York, is back with his new wife and seems to be very successful. He invites them to a small dinner at his place. Morgan writes his number on Meg's arm. Morgan seems to be a fan of Nick and a cool guy. The pair went to Cambridge together. They go to a restaurant bar, and Nick talks about Morgan, mentioning that Nick is the reason Morgan is thriving, as he introduced him to everyone. In the suite, they playfully chase each other while Nick is brushing his teeth. However, Meg accidentally cuts Nick's neck with the pull-tab ring she is still wearing. Nick bleeds, but jokingly asks Meg to show him her breasts as an apology, and Meg complies. They go silent on each other as Nick checks and puts a band-aid on. Later, they go to bed and have whispered conversations. Nick jokingly asks his wife's consent, but Meg just smiles and says she is very sleepy. In the middle of the night, Nick leaves the bed and Meg wakes up. Nick is in the other room, posting some black and white photos on the wall. Meg wakes up and finds Nick. She discovers him outside on the balcony, just chilling. Despite still feeling a bit bitter about their mounting separation, she expresses her fear that he left. Nick, in response, hugs Meg, assuring her that he is there. They continue their Paris weekend trip. Meg inquires about Morgan, who likes Nick a lot, and seems to really want to see him. She gives him the idea that Morgan can help him. Nick expresses a desire to do the ultimate Cambridge novels that are very much part of pop culture from the 70s. They go to a museum and then to a bookstore, where Meg hoards lots of books, and tells Nick to pick anything he wants from the pile so he can cut out the pictures. So, as a reminder from the other night, Nick cuts out the pictures and posts them. Nick is happy and hoards more books, since Meg is paying for them. In the hotel room, Nick expresses his appreciation for Meg's body, mentioning that although she's older, she is still very attractive. Meg, however, shares a story about a young man who once tried to hit on her. Nick recalls their generation in the 70s, where a revolutionary and subcultural way of living prevailed. This is why Nick wants to spend the weekend on their anniversary, celebrating their commitment to each other through marriage. But Meg comments that Nick is just afraid of living alone, adding that he always follows her around like a sick child. Nick wonders why nobody wants his company, but Meg just grits. Later, Meg struts around with her new shoes and dress. Nick contemplates on giving up on everything he likes and starting a pity party. But then Meg gives Nick a surprise and commands him to get down on his knees while she strip teases, but not all the way, making Nick act like a puppy. They prepare that night to go over to Morgan's, but get distracted by a television show featuring a 50s dance. They dance together and kiss. Meg goes to shop for Nick and comes back, telling Nick to ask Morgan for help to publish his book. Meg tells him in a metaphor that Nick has never had the courage to do something for himself. Nick is somehow offended, and passively-aggressively tells Meg about a computer guy named Melik, sarcastically of course. Nick accuses Meg that she's having an affair with the computer guy, because Meg's laptop always breaks. Meg is disgusted by the accusations. She berates him. As they descend, they continue arguing, with Nick insisting on Meg's affair with a younger man as the reason for their pending separation. Meg, though, berates him that she has never lied to him, and regrets depriving herself of her own company. Meg expresses her desire to be in her own company, and wants to sell the house and kick him out. Meg brings up Nick's own affair with a student 15 years ago, and also the issue about their children whenever there is a problem, pointing out that Nick is nonchalant about it. They arrive at Morgan's place, and Meg is very angry at Nick for the insults. Meg takes him by the collar. Nick tells Meg that he knows about it because of Meg's behavior, suggesting an affair with the said man. Nick expresses his love for Meg, but Meg says love fades. Morgan welcomes them to the small gathering and introduces them. Meg and Nick, though feeling nervous about meeting new people, still bitter, joke about leaving Meg alone, since she seems to want it. Morgan introduces them to the people, who are all philosophers, literature experts, writers, economists, and seemingly artists. One man, Jean-Pierre, gives Meg a look of interest. Morgan introduces the new wife, who looks inappropriately younger and is now pregnant. Later on, Morgan signs his book and gives it to Nick. They talk, and Morgan expresses having thought of Nick many times. Later, Morgan discusses having mental health problems until something profound happened to him. He left his wife and everything he had, starting a new life. Now he is enjoying the new life with the new wife, until she sees the real Morgan. Nick is worried, though, about how he will go through that again if it happens. Morgan says he only wants to be adored, because he is vain. Nick doesn't share Morgan's delusions and mindset, thinking that Morgan is giving up everything just to be free. Morgan, though, does not misunderstand, and recalls their youth, and how they grew up very comfortable. Morgan begins to deduce Nick's life and thinks it's a breezy, carefree lifestyle. Nick does not negate him. Morgan suddenly invites Nick to go somewhere that requires a large amount of money. He impulsively doubles it and agrees. They toast on it. Meanwhile, Meg is left alone, and Eve approaches her, mistaking her for an artist. Meg, uninterested in making conversation with Eve, drifts away. However, Eve doesn't give up and follows Meg around, where Meg talks about their children leaving. Later, Eve excitedly says that she loves Morgan so much that she spends time with him always. However, Meg is morose with her belief about love. Then Meg tells Eve about Nick's accusation of her cheating. But Meg switches the story to Eve's baby due date. Nick looks around the apartment, inspecting every frame and material. He sees a young man smoking a cigarette, probably Morgan's son. The young man invites him to drink and asks if Nick is enjoying the party. He is only visiting his dad for the weekend. Meg is outside sightseeing. Later, Jean-Pierre approaches her. They talk about Paris, so Jean-Pierre shows her the famous tourist spots in the city from a distance. As they talk more, Meg tells him a situation of a woman like her, where she is dissatisfied, angry, and in fear of getting old. Jean-Pierre thinks it is a good thing that Meg is aware, and invites her out for a drink at a bar nearby. The young man and Nick talk about living in different cities. The young man talks about his relationship with Morgan, his father. Nick asks about the mom, to which the young man answers that his mom almost tried to end herself, but she is already over it. Nick and the kid start smoking weed and get to know more of each other. Meanwhile, Meg interrupts and enters the room and asks the boy what Nick is talking about. Meg tells Nick that a man has invited her out for a drink. Nick pleads her not to, but Meg insists she wants to. Eve announces Morgan's book, where she hypes him up about how hard he worked on it. Morgan gives a speech. Then later he directs the attention to Nick and recalls their days during Cambridge University, where Nick had a lot of contributions to Morgan's development. Morgan raises a glass to Nick. Nick now has his turn to make a speech, where he tells the truth about himself and the reality of how he is living now, contrary to what Morgan has achieved, or thought Nick had achieved. He also reveals the truth about the state of his failing marriage. Of course, the atmosphere becomes awkward with air silence. Meg takes her turn to speak and talks about her husband still being able to make her happy. These words alone are enough for Nick to be reassured of Meg's love. They head out later, and Morgan accompanies them, asking questions. However, Meg and Nick just get away without saying anything to him, or even to each other. They go by the La Seine Bridge. They spend their time at another restaurant bar, rekindling their passion through conversation. Nick cuts out more pictures and pastes them on the wall, vandalizing it. It's almost the end of their trip, however. Upon returning to their room, their hotel suite is filled with men, who are cleaning up the room and evicting them. The man says they have already been checked out. Meg steals a hat from the room, and now the men in suits are in pursuit as they run away. However, they are stopped by the hotel manager, and it turns out their credit card has been maxed out. They are shown a lengthy bill, and they have to compensate for the room damages and the taxes too. However, they have no other options for paying, which greatly upsets the hotel manager. They walk out of the hotel room, so Nick decides to call Morgan. However, Jack, their son, calls him. Nick decides not to help out Jack, and tells him not to go back to their house, but to stay with his wife in another house. They go to a cafe instead, and spend the whole day there. Later on, Morgan arrives to help them with their trouble. Morgan offers his place until it's sorted out. Nick later plays the jukebox and starts dancing. Then Meg follows later, and then Morgan, and all three of them start dancing.